So how would you find the music age we're living? Because in terms of movies, we could say that the big orchestra began in the 30s, and then in the 80s we have the synthesizers.
Yeah, yeah.
So although there are a few composers that still stick to the orchestra, some movies that were made in the history of cinema, if you listen to a score, are a little bit dated.
Mm-hmm.
So how would you define this age?
I think there's a parallel between what's happening in music today and what's happening with visual effects. In visual effects, you can hear filmmakers, I think even George Lucas has said something to the effect of, I can do anything I can imagine. With computer effects, anything I can think of, I can put on the screen. Music is in a very similar place thanks to technology. Anything that you can imagine, you can do. So contemporary synthesis and sampling and electronic music makes sounds possible and simple that just were neither a few decades ago. And orchestral recording has improved. There's more orchestras around the world that want to record. So similar to a filmmaker preparing to tell a story and deciding what kind of visual effects they're going to use, I think a composer has a similar test they have to give themselves. You can do anything you want. So you have to set more parameters for yourself. At least this is what I find for myself, that I can do anything that the budget will allow or my imagination will allow. So I'm going to try to set certain parameters and try to be creative within these parameters, because otherwise it's sort of overwhelming. And if you use all the sounds that are at your disposal, it just turns into mush. Just like movies that overuse computer effects become so dizzying that you kind of lose the thread of what you're supposed to be watching. So I think that's a very real thing, and I think you can see good and bad examples of it. And it's just something that I deal with every time I take on a new project, is deciding what are the sounds going to be. A good example of this is actually Black Sails, where the showrunner and I made a show prior to that called Human Target, where we had this huge orchestra at our disposal every week. And
great show, by the way.
It was a fun one. I love that show.
80s show.
I know, totally. Totally. And then he makes Black Sails, which is extremely different in tone than Human Target. And he earmarks a music budget for that show, the same way that he did on Human Target. And when we started watching the show, I was like, what are we doing with this? Like, do you want to do an orchestra on this? And he looked at me like, I don't think so, man. Like, we could have totally put a big orchestra on that show. The budget was there. The resources were there. But that's not what the story needed. And so instead we put all of that time and energy and resource into developing something very unique and something very interesting. And then we created a very concise set of musical rules that the show adheres to. And I think it has an identity because of that.
Mm-hmm. You first worked with Frank Darabont for the Walking
Dead, yeah.
What was his instructions of the music? Because he's very musical.
Yes.
And he likes the 40s and the 50s.
Yes. Frank Darabont and I spent a lot of time talking about how the music would function both in the first episode of Walking Dead and in the subsequent season, and thusly how it would work beyond that. In my opinion, I felt like the horror genre went through what I call a nuclear arms race in the 80s. You had, in the 70s, soundtracks like The Exorcist, and Jerry Goldsmith's score for The Omen. Things that have a very strong identity, but when you actually watch those movies, the use of music is pretty sparse. Mm-hmm. Then you have the 80s, okay? And in the 80s, it gets louder and louder and louder and louder, and then by the 90s, you have a score and a movie like Scream, which is a satire, but it's also not. Scream, to me, is the horror genre. It's the music. The music is screaming at you. Be scared! And so Frank and I spent some time talking about this. Like, how can we stay scary over 90 minutes, over 6 hours? Let's say this thing goes to 100 episodes. We were daydreaming. And, of course, we're going to get there now. But we felt like we needed to de-escalate, bring everything down. Bring down the volume, bring down the musical occurrences. So in that 90-minute first episode, we were very sparse. There was very little music. There's one big sequence where Morgan is trying to shoot the walker that it used to be his wife. That's like 6 minutes of music right there. Otherwise, there's about 18 minutes of music over the course of 90 minutes, and that ratio is very low. And what it created was an environment where you just hear silence. You hear the sound of the wind, the crickets and the cicadas. There's no trains, there's no buses, there's no planes, there's no sound design that is normally occupying the sound space. So that quiet is the music. It is telling you emotionally about the devastation in the world. And then when the very slightest little chord comes in, this very dissonant little string harmony, it has a big impact. And that kind of set the tone. And over the course of however many episodes we've done, I think we're approaching, it will round up to 100 real soon. The score's definitely gotten louder. I mean, it's definitely gotten bigger. I've had some epic battle sequences and hordes of zombies. But because we started back at this very small place, it's been possible. I think it's been a very restrained and relatively tasteful score. And that was in large part to Frank Darabont's influence.
You look for instruments out of the box,
Yeah.
the strange instruments to incorporate into the music. Do you use them as something to do the score, or because you do the score you look for the instruments?
Wow. Sometimes I'll hear an instrument and I'll want to use it. Mm-hmm. When I did 10 Cloverfield Lane, I used this weird instrument called a blaster beam because I grew up loving Star Trek: The Motion Picture, and Jerry Goldsmith wrote for a blaster beam, and I just always remembered that. And the narrative kind of fit this big, large, heavy, kind of strange foreign sound. In the case of Walking Dead, I actually drew from the geography. It takes place in Georgia. And so I used a lot of like bluegrass instruments. There's banjo, there's slide guitar, there's dulcimer, that have distortion on them. They're distorted, they're detuned, they're sometimes in some cases actually broken. I consider them the Walker versions of those instruments. And in fact, throughout the first few seasons of the show, whenever you see a zombie walking or doing anything, there's this sound that sounds like this detuned piano or something. It's actually a banjo. It's a bluegrass instrument because it's like, we're in Georgia. So I got that inspiration directly from a piece of information in the narrative itself.
Mm-hmm. Okay, and the last question, you're doing the score for God of War. So how does it affect that the video games, in this case God of War particularly, has a lot of special sounds and mixed sounds where you can't hear anything
Yes.
but the monsters and the growls and the screams?
Believe me, it was definitely a beginning point for the conversations that I've had and I'm continuing to have with the director and everybody at Santa Monica Studio and everybody at Sony, because I've always felt that the action video game franchises reached a point where they were so loud, the combination of sound effects and music were so bombastic that I wouldn't have anything to say musically in that genre. And I think this God of War is going to be very different. The footage that was unveiled at E3 just a few weeks ago starts off with a little boy playing with toys in the snow. If that doesn't already set a different tone, then I don't know what would, Yes, there's large-scale combat and there's giant monsters, but there's also a character story that I think is a little more related and rooted in our emotional context than previous God of War games that were very hyper driven by revenge and epic stories. They were great. They're great big mythological stories. If anything, this is the deconstruction of a myth. This is the myth that has grown into an old man. So these are the things that are interesting to me. These are the things that I can latch onto emotionally and I can talk about musically. And I believe when the game finally comes out, you'll hear that, the game developers understand that and value that, and that you will find places where the music is at the forefront of the mix, and then there's places where the sound effects are the forefront of the mix. But we're very aware of that, and I definitely am not interested in writing 4 hours of just extremely loud action music. I mean, it's just exhausting. And I'm much more interested in telling a cinematic story. And I think people are going to be really, really surprised and impressed with God of War when it comes back.